Okay, so the running title again for our teaching on First Corinthians is How Grace Transforms the Church. And these are really bad. This theme really shows us how God, in His grace, does restore sanity where there is chaos. We see Him bringing order into moral chaos, spiritual chaos, and even chaos that breaks out in the whole community. And so, what's powerful about this letter is that God isn't only interested in working in our lives as individuals, He's also committed to transforming us as a community. And God works through the context of community, right? Both in terms of getting the message of reconciling people to Christ out into the world, and in the way that He uses healthy community to bring healing and restoration to brokenness. And that's one of the reasons why this book is really cool. It's super grounded. It's real. They talk about real issues that people are dealing with. And anyway, it deals with the kinds of things that in one way or another, every one of us has dealt with or is facing. So, all right, I don't think that there's anything that could be more personally relevant to Paul's discussion in 1 Corinthians chapters 6 and 7 of our sexual identity and sexuality, which we've been talking about for several weeks now. And this morning, we're going to talk about sexuality in the context of singleness and divorce. So like two fringe areas of what it looks like in relationship. The beginning of a long-term committed relationship and the dissolving of a long-term committed relationship. And so I want to say, first of all, like we are going to address these topics with some honesty and sensitivity because these things are deeply personal. These are areas where every one of us has been touched in some way. And for some of us, these experiences continue to shape our lives today. So we want to understand this whole area of sexuality in all of its breadth, and in terms that Paul is talking about here in 1 Corinthians. All right, so this morning we're just going to simply move through the passage almost point by point, because he begins this chapter by saying, "Now concerning the things about which you wrote." So that tells us that this section of the letter, starting in chapter 7, Paul is responding to specific questions that the Corinthians had sent him. All right, so starting in verse 7, Paul says, "I wish that everyone were single, just as I am. But God gives to some the gift of marriage, and to others the gift of singleness. So I say to those who aren't married and to widows, it's better to stay unmarried, just as I am. But if they do not practice self-control, they should go ahead and get married. It is better to marry than to burn with passion." And so right off the bat, we need to slow down and unpack what Paul actually means, because the context is really important. So again, Paul is responding to a very specific situation in the church at Corinth. Some of what Paul says in this chapter reflects direct commands from the Lord, but other things fall into this area of situational advice, where God hasn't really spoken directly into some of these cases. And Paul offers pastoral wisdom and discernment to help believers make wise decisions. So when Paul says, "I wish that you were all like me, single," he's not saying that singleness is God's will for everyone. Rather, he's speaking from a pastoral perspective in the light of what he calls the present distress. So, towards the end of chapter 7, I'm jumping forward. In verse 26, Paul says, "Because of the present crisis, I think it is best to remain as you are." So, we can't identify the present distress with certainty. The Bible doesn't define it for us. But some scholars point to several possibilities. We know historically, a few years before Paul wrote this letter, that there were famines and food shortages in the area that were described by the historian Josephus, and it's also recorded in Acts. So there may have been some economic hardship affecting the area. There may also have been increasing social pressure on Christians living in a deeply pagan environment like Corinth. But beyond those external pressures, there was also a crisis happening inside the church itself. And there seems to be confusion surrounding this idea of sexuality. All right, so the city of Corinth was known throughout the ancient world for sexual immorality. We talked about that in Dax's introduction, like Corinth would be like the Las Vegas of its time. And so some people, when they came to faith in Christ, some believers continued in sexual freedom, while others swung to this opposite extreme and began arguing that true spirituality required rejecting sex altogether, even within marriage. And apparently some of the couples had begun abstaining from sexual relations because they believed that it was the more spiritual path. And that created tension within marriages. And in some cases, husbands were responding badly and leaving their marriages and returning to prostitution, which was normal in that area. So it seems that Paul's goal is not only to talk about these specific behaviors, but to restore a healthy and balanced understanding of sexuality before people begin making life-altering decisions about marriage, singleness, or divorce. So in effect, Paul is saying here, like, slow down. Don't make life-altering decisions in the middle of confusion and crisis. Let's first get a clear picture of what God intends. So whatever the present crisis was, we know Paul's advice here is situational, because in another letter, he gives different counsel. In 1 Timothy 5:14, it says, "Therefore I want younger widows to get married, have children, manage their households, and give the enemy no opportunity for reproach." So writing to the church in Ephesus and addressing a completely different issue involving widows and single people, Paul actually encourages them to marry and build households. So in one setting, Paul's saying remain single, may be wise, and in another, he encourages marriage. And so that contrast, I think, highlights how significant whatever this present distress or crisis was that the Corinthian church was facing. And at the same time, Paul wants to affirm something very important. Singleness is not a plan B lifestyle. What I'm trying to say is that singleness might be God's intended purpose for some, not just a backup plan because marriage didn't work or because they haven't found the right person. But it could be because it's a genuine calling. So there is dignity and value and virtue in being single, just as there is dignity, value, and virtue in being married. And in fact, Paul highlights some positive advantages of singleness. So the highest value of Christian living is our capacity to serve Christ, right? We're servants of the Lord. And Paul says that in some ways, a single person does have a distinct advantage in that regard. So in verses 32 through 34, Paul writes, "I want you to be free from the concern of this life An unmarried man can spend his time doing the Lord's work and thinking how to please him. But a married man has to also think of his earthly responsibilities and how to please his wife. His interests are divided. So Paul says that such a person's interests are divided, but that's not like an unholy division. It's just simply the reality of being married. But Paul is pointing out, or what he's pointing out, is that single people often have a freedom that married people do not. They can sometimes make decisions that place themselves in situations where they can serve Christ more directly and with more flexibility. For example, a single person might walk away from a high-paying or high-demanding career because they want to make themselves available for God's work, right? They can relocate, they can serve in ministry, or pursue opportunities that require tremendous flexibility and sometimes even place them in difficult or potentially dangerous situations. And those kinds of decisions become much more complicated when you're also responsible for a spouse and children and the practical needs of running a household. So Paul's point is not that singleness is spiritually superior to marriage. His point is that singleness can offer a unique freedom, one that sometimes allows people to make courageous decisions that position them to serve Christ in remarkable ways. All right, so Paul also points out another virtue of singleness in verses 29 through 31. In this passage, he talks about the freedom that can come from not having the added fear and responsibility for a family during times of distress. So it says, "The remaining time is very short. Those with wives should not focus only on their marriage, and those using the things of the world should not become attached to them." So we also know from history that by the middle of the first century, as the Christian movement was spreading throughout the Roman Empire, the opposition to Christianity was also beginning to grow. Both Jewish and Roman authorities were increasingly hostile to the claims of the church. And eventually, by the mid-60s AD, under the reign of Emperor Nero, persecution of Christians would even take on the character of official Roman policy. So it's possible Paul could sense that pressure building, and he could be concerned about believers making marriage decisions that will not only affect their own lives, but also the lives of a spouse and potentially future children. So that's potentially part of the background behind his words in this section. Paul writes that those who have wives should not become completely absorbed in the things of marriage, and those who use the things of this world should not become overly attached to them, because the present form of this world is passing away. So there is a sense in which Paul sees that pressure increasing in the area. The clamp is beginning to come down, and he knows that following Christ may soon involve very costly decisions, right? Early Christian records, along with Roman historians like Tacitus, describe believers being brought before local magistrates and commanded to renounce the lordship of Christ. And when they refused, many were executed. And that's men, women, and sometimes even children. So in light of this, it's possible Paul saw this on the horizon, and he's saying that there can be an advantage to singleness. Standing before a magistrate and making a decision that will affect only your own life is a different kind of decision than standing there knowing that your choice may also determine the fate of your spouse or your children. And so there is like a certain sobriety in Paul's words here. And in this particular context, singleness could provide a freedom that married people might not have. Okay, so there are some advantages about the single life, but there's also some unique tensions that come with the single life. And I want to suggest three perspectives. So, first, there's the challenge of sexuality and identity for the single person. And we've talked about this previously, but we live in a society that often measures personal value in terms of like sexual desirability. Um, we talked about this the other night at group. Like our culture sends constant messages um, about being wanted, being desirable, being accepted, and they're all defined in sexual terms. And at a psychological and social level, all of us have deep needs to be accepted and valued. But in a culture that has lost sight of many deeper sources of meaning, those needs often get attached almost entirely to physical attractiveness and sexual attention. So, for single Christians who make a principled commitment to sexual faithfulness, this could create like some enormous pressure. They might find themselves swimming against a powerful current of cultural values that are just constant all around them. And that pressure is not only about behavior, it also touches on identity. And so questions naturally come up here like, am I desirable? Am I acceptable? If I'm not being desired by someone, does that mean something is wrong with me? And those are real tensions that we need to acknowledge. So at the same time, it's important to understand that relationships don't just happen, they form through these specific kinds of connections and attachments. And if we don't understand that process, it's easy for just our desires and insecurities to lead us faster than wisdom would. So I want to introduce this. It's called the relationship attachment model. And it comes from a book called How to Avoid Falling in Love with a Jerk. I think they've like revised it. Now it's like the newer edition is How to Avoid Falling in Love with a Jerk or Jerkette. But it's written by this guy, by John Van Epp. And the relationship attachment model, it illustrates these key bonds that form the foundation of every romantic relationship. And so there's to know, trust, rely, commit, and touch. And so much of our sexual identity is formed by the culture around us. And this model really does help in seeing how relationships can form in a healthy way or in a far less confusing, complicated way. All right, so let's walk through each of these bonds here. And we're also going to look at them in the context of like a premarital context and then a marriage committed context. So the first one is know. And the definition is knowing is about truly understanding your partner's inner world, values, beliefs, emotional patterns, family background, and personality. And feeling known is just as important as knowing. So in a premarital context, what this means is take your time, right? Getting to know someone deeply means paying attention to who they are in different contexts, not just how they are with you. And so for the married or committed person, it's also important to keep in front of your mind that people do evolve over time. I had this friend years ago that his like mantra, he said it so many times, he's like, people don't really change. The only thing they ever change is their pants. And I don't believe that. I think people do evolve over time. And so for the married or committed, knowing looks like you keep asking questions, right? You stay curious. You continue learning about your partner. And emotional intimacy grows through that shared discovery. So 2 is trust. And the definition here is trust is the confidence you have in your perception of the other person, your mental picture of them. Trust increases when your expectations match reality. All right, so I got like a silly example here. Like, so if you bake a chocolate cake for your partner's birthday because you think it's their favorite cake and they're going to really love it, only to find out that they actually love raspberry, not chocolate. That moment shows a gap between what you thought you knew and what's true, which affects trust. Right? And in a premarital context, trust is built through time and consistency. How do they handle conflict? How do they handle stress? Do their actions match their words? And in a married or committed context, trust deepens through honesty, repair after hurt, and reliability, especially when life gets hard. All right, so the third bond is rely. So relying means depending on each other to meet needs emotionally, practically, and relationally. And it flows from trust, and it is strengthened by mutual support. So in a premarital context, be careful of relying too much too soon, right? Healthy reliance means observing how dependable they are while still maintaining your independence. And in a married committed context, in long-term relationships, mutual reliance is part of intimacy. It's not about being perfect. It's about being present and responsive. All right, so then we come to the fourth one, which is commit. And commitment is the degree of dedication to the relationship and the sense that you belong to one another. Healthy commitment includes mutual respect and doesn't erase personal identity. So again, premarital commitment should follow knowing, trusting, and relying, not come before them. So rushing commitment can blind you to maybe some potential red flags in the relationship. And in the married and committed, real commitment means choosing each other even when it's hard. It involves sacrifice, loyalty, and the willingness to grow together. And so the last bond that we're going to talk about is touch. And then I swear I'm going to get somewhere with this at the end. We're just defining these things right now. But touch, physical connection, ranging from casual affection to sexual intimacy. Touch is powerful because it releases bonding chemicals in the brain that can create feelings of closeness, sometimes faster than the relationship is actually ready to handle. So, premarital, let physical intimacy align with emotional intimacy. So if it moves ahead of these other bonds, it can cloud decision making and create premature attachment that it's not ready, the relationship's not ready for. And in a married, committed context, again, touch remains a vital part of connection. It should be grounded in mutual consent, safety, and communication. And in long-term relationships, this slider doesn't have to be the lowest, but it should reflect a shared intentional bond. So what do I mean by slider? This is where I'm going with all this, all right? So you can imagine each of these as sliders on a soundboard, all right? Each one representing the level or strength of that bond in your relationship. So in dating, the healthiest progression is for each slider to stay lower than the one to its left, right? So for example, don't trust someone more than you know them. And in marriage or committed partnerships, these levels shift and they balance differently, but the principle of intentional connection still applies. So you might be sitting there asking yourself why sequence and balance matters. And the RAM, or relational attention model, helps us recognize when relationships are out of sync. So, for example, when physical intimacy is really high, the slider's all the way up to the top, but trust is low, or someone feels deeply committed but doesn't really know their partner, these imbalances often lead to confusion and frustration or emotional instability, right? And if we're getting our definition of sexuality, identity, relationship, if that's being defined in the culture, all you have to do is listen to some pop music and it talks about this, right? The sliders to the left or to the right, commitment and touch, they're all the way up. Every song is about that. Nobody talks about knowing, trusting, and relying. The whole relationship is grounded on commitment or not, and highly sexual in touch. And so you can see where that creates a lot of confusion. And so for couples preparing for marriage, this model encourages building a foundation that's rooted in more than just chemistry. And for married or long-term couples, it offers a way to assess like what's working and where you need growth. So it's kind of a cool thing. Anyway, I thought it was cool. So going back to singles and the tensions surrounding being single. The second one is the idea of the search for the right person, right? So many people assume that if they could just find the right person, everything would fall into place. And so some of us who are married know that we entered marriage under exactly that same illusion, right? But the truth is that there's no such thing as a perfect person who will complete us. A healthier way to think about it is not finding the right person, but becoming the right person. And the real question is not simply who should I marry, but who is God shaping me to become? And God's goal is to form us into whole people in Christ. And then if opportunities for partnership come along, then we pursue them not because we have another person that completes us, but because we're able to share the life God has already given us with them. And that distinction is important. So the third thing, or the third tension, is there can be sometimes this tendency for disappointment in this area and to drift into a kind of legalistic thinking about God, right? It could manifest itself in different ways along different lines of thought. But for example, a person might begin to think, if God really cared about me, he would provide a spouse. But what is implied in that statement is it assumes that if God is good, he somehow owes us a husband or wife. And we know that God is certainly good and he gives good gifts. But the question we have to ask honestly is, does God owe any of us marriage? And if that expectation becomes deeply rooted in our hearts, disappointment and loneliness can eventually turn into resentment, where those feelings are projected onto God as if he were somehow responsible for that pain. And so sometimes the thinking goes in the other direction. A person could begin to believe that their singleness is somehow God's punishment. They may think something along the lines of like, well, maybe I made mistakes early in life. Maybe I was too sexually immoral when I was younger. And now God is withholding marriage as some kind of penalty. And some people consciously believe that. And others might carry it subconsciously. Either way, it's deeply damaging. And that's not who God is. And God does have a plan. And so finally, it also kind of brings up an important responsibility, I think, for us who are married to think about. Like, we need to find ways to care for the people that are single around us in our community. Part of that could simply mean like creating space for honest conversations about the pressures and the struggles that they may experience. It means listening well, walking alongside one another in Christian community. But it also means making sure that single people are fully connected to the life of the church, and they're valued and they're included and they're engaged in really meaningful ways. So something to think about. Okay, so that was singleness. Now we're going to drift into the second issue that Paul addresses, beginning in verse 10. So he writes, "But for those who are married, I have a command that comes not from me, but from the Lord. A wife must not leave her husband, but if she does leave him, let her remain single or else be reconciled to him, and the husband must not leave his wife." So this is a pretty radical teaching on several levels, and again, it deserves careful attention, and context is important here. So Paul is speaking specifically to Christian couples within the Corinthian church. And that's clear from the contrast that he draws in verse 12 when he begins to address marriages between believers and non-believers. But that is a separate issue, and I believe Dax will do that next week. So Paul is saying to married Christians, God's design and will for you is to remain married. And this is not simply Paul's personal opinion or situational advice. He explicitly states that this is the Lord's instruction. And he's grounding his teaching in Christ's words in Matthew 19:3, where Jesus addresses divorce in this passage. And so some Pharisees approached Jesus with a very familiar challenge. They're testing him, and they're asking, like, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all? And this was a common question at the time because some Jewish teachers allowed divorce for very trivial reasons, right? If a wife burned the dinner or spoke too loudly in public or embarrassed her husband in some way, divorce could essentially be justified for these minor inconveniences. And Jesus responds first by acknowledging reality. He says, Moses allowed divorce because of the hardness of your hearts. But he immediately goes further, clarifying God's intent. Divorce should only occur in cases of sexual immorality. Marriage is meant to be permanent, a covenant commitment between two people that is not to be abandoned simply because difficulties arise. So, this is exactly the issue Paul's addressing here. And many Corinthians were tempted to flee difficult marriages in search of an easier situation. So some husbands and wives thought that this marriage isn't working the way I want, or she's too spiritual, or he's not interested in God, and I need something better. So, for example, there may have been situations where a wife was deeply devoted in prayer or spiritual disciplines, while her husband felt that there was this mismatch in desires, including sexual intimacy. And tension like this could drive people to think that divorce was the solution. But Paul's response is grounded in Jesus' teaching. That's not God's way, right? Marriage is a covenant to remain committed, even when issues are difficult. It's not to be abandoned on a whim or simply for personal convenience. So this teaching reinforces the permanence and sacredness of marriage and reminds believers that life's difficulties do not give us permission to walk away from our covenant commitments. And from a biblical perspective, repeatedly divorcing and remarrying because a spouse is not what you expected could be seen as a kind of like serial adultery. You marry someone, discover that they're not who you thought they were, you divorce them, and then marry someone else, only to discover again that they're not perfect, and this cycle morally speaking, is equivalent to adultery in God's eyes. So this raises this very painful issue of divorce. And for many of us, this is intensely personal, right? People in this room have experienced divorce. It's painful on many levels. And as we discuss this, I want us to prayerfully consider, like, what is God calling me to understand about this issue? How does grace fit here? And how does he want me to bring healing? And so we have to be honest, like, there are legitimate grounds for divorce. Infidelity is the clearest example, right? There's no question that adultery can violate that covenant of marriage. However, I think it's important to make this statement. Divorce doesn't have to be the outcome of adultery, right? Couples can work through this and decide to stay together and rebuild trust. But adultery is probably the clearest example. But there are other reasons, right? The hardness of the human hearts can create other situations where divorce may be the responsible choice. Things like abandonment, abuse, situations where a spouse is actively harmful can also be legitimate grounds for ending a marriage. And because of this, I think navigating these situations requires very careful discernment, prayer, seeking counsel from God and from wise and trusted people. So Paul's instructions in 1 Corinthians almost like assume discernment. And I want to emphasize this point, like the goal is not to legislate rigid rules. It's to help believers make choices under God's guidance. And so we also have to confront the unavoidable pain of broken marriages, right? Some of us were divorced before we came to know Christ. Our marriages failed in the context of unbelief and brokenness. And that's already painful. But here, Paul is speaking to Christians whose marriages are going south, even though they're believers. When the thought of divorce enters your mind, you're forced to confront pain you'd rather avoid, right? The pain of betrayal, unmet expectations, being sinned against. Paul calls people in this situation to face the pain instead of fleeing. And it seems as though the Corinthians wanted to choose the easier way out. But that pattern often repeats itself. When unresolved pain and brokenness are carried into another relationship, the cycle continues. And that's why statistics show that second marriages can fail at twice the rate of first marriages that fail half the time, right? I haven't looked at it in a while, but the statistics are pretty high with that, outside and inside the church. And unresolved issues create a repetition of brokenness. So the challenge here is that God calls us to stay, to face the pain, to seek his guidance in the midst of difficulty, rather than escaping into a new relationship to avoid the work of healing and reconciliation. So it's also crucial for us to be able to honestly name the pain in our marriages, to name how we have been wronged. And that means saying, this dynamic in my marriage has brought enormous pain into my life, and just owning that reality. But honesty also includes owning our own faults, recognizing that we too have inflicted pain through judgment or coldness or self-righteousness or other failures. When trust has been violated, it's natural to focus on how hurt we are. But part of the healing process is to identify both the pain we have suffered and the pain that we have caused. True reconciliation requires this kind of honesty and humility. And we also have to recognize the legacy of divorce, particularly how it affects children. And in our culture, there's a common mantra that divorce is okay if it's for the sake of the kids. There are these extreme cases of abuse, abandonment, sexual immorality, all these situations that are unsafe, where divorce may be necessary to protect the children. But most marriages, most marriages end for less critical reasons, right? I can't forgive you, or I don't trust you, or I'm tired of this, or I want someone else. These decisions still leave a profound impact on kids, right? And social research is pretty clear about this. Children benefit when they see their parents pursuing healing, reconciliation, and restored relationships. And furthermore, unresolved pain can also carry into their adult relationships as well. And then there's this other dimension that we need to understand, and that's the costly decision to allow grace to produce reconciliation and real change in a marriage. Right? Marriage pain cuts deep. When intimacy is violated, trust is broken, hearts are wounded, it leaves scars that are not easily healed. And yet God offers a path through this pain. The path is grounded in the unmerited mercy of God. Right? We have all experienced forgiveness that we did not earn. Jesus Christ entered our broken world into our broken lives and bore the cost of our forgiveness. And forgiveness is never free. It always comes at a cost. And the same principle applies in marriage. Forgiveness and reconciliation require a cost. It requires courage and humility and the Spirit of God working in our lives. And that's what makes Christian marriage unique. It's a space where the transforming power of God's grace can confront this pain, can foster reconciliation, can bring real change. And it is costly, yes, but it also is redemptive, deeply healing, and faithful to God's design for marriage. If I forgive a debt, that debt doesn't just disappear. I've taken it on myself. I've absorbed it. All forgiveness requires a costly decision to embrace the offense, to carry the burden, and to absorb the cost. And in marriage, those who have experienced the unmerited mercy of God now have the opportunity to extend that same grace to their spouse. We can allow ourselves to be driven by unresolved pain, or we can submit our pain and our spouse's pain to the cross of Christ, acknowledging that He has already borne the burden of our offenses. Because we have been forgiven, we now have the capacity to forgive. And this is not easy, right? It's a costly choice. But choosing not to forgive also comes with consequences that we can't avoid, right? Bitterness, alienation, emotional disconnection. Choosing to forgive, on the other hand, allows God's mercy to begin transforming a painful marriage into a redemptive one. So forgiveness in marriage is not abstract, right? It's concrete. It's rooted in grace. Not in holding past sins over each other's heads It's in choosing to move forward in honesty and vulnerability, saying to God, show us the way forward, right? Help us to love and serve each other as you would have us to do. And in this process, couples can experience real transformation, learning what it means for God's grace to shape their lives and their marriage. And many of us here this morning have already seen this happen, right? Our marriages are living testimonies of God's mercy, where past betrayals have been healed, relationships strengthened. For those who have not yet personally encountered Christ, there is hope. Approaching God in personal repentance and asking for his forgiveness allows us to experience his mercy firsthand. And with that experience, even broken relationships, including marriages, can be approached with hope and healing, and there's possibility there. All right, so we could have ended on that, but I do want to just add this other part for us to reflect on. And I think it's a common temptation. So it's the idea of living in a marriage physically present, but emotionally distant, right? Many commit to staying because it's the right thing to do. Yet in their hearts, they've drifted away. They may be avoiding pain or avoiding the cost of the work of forgiveness or avoiding humility. And we have to ask ourselves, what pain am I avoiding? Right? What pride am I protecting? And am I refusing to extend my spouse the same forgiveness God has shown me? So, also, marriages don't exist in isolation, right? The Christian community is a crucial support system. Friends, mentors, fellow believers can speak truth into our lives. They can call us to accountability. They can help us to process these difficulties. And living in a sealed bubble will often suffocate a marriage, right? When couples open themselves up to trusted, objective voices, they can begin to experience God's goodness and transformation. And I think this is the vision Paul paints for marriage in the Christian community. It's costly, it's grace-driven, redemptive, and deeply powerful. And how we respond to these challenges, whether in singleness, marriage, or the work of forgiveness, can either catalyze a victorious experience of God's grace in our lives, or it can allow bitterness and pain to dominate. And so the choice is ultimately ours. And it's grounded in the mercy and the love of Christ. And that's it. That's all I have.